Well, good evening, buenos tardes. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Neil Chase. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at CalMatters. If you don't know CalMatters, we are a news organization. We're journalists. We cover news about California from all over the state. We're based in Sacramento. We have people all over California. And our goal is to cover state government and explain what's going on in California so that people can understand what's going on and can become involved, can become engaged, know the issues, and become engaged in the issues and be part of your own governance. And so we're very excited to be here today, to be able to be with you and to have the conversation we're about to have that is so important. You can talk about these things in Sacramento or in Washington or somewhere else, but you can't do that unless you talk about these issues in the place where they affect people, right? And we have to be here talking about how people here are affected, so the legislators and other people, whenever make decisions they make, are actually things that are going to work. And that's why we have journalists all over the state, including Anna, who's based here in Bakersfield. I'm going to turn it over to her. We're going to have a conversation. We'll follow the conversation with time for questions and answers, a special guest at the end, and we'll have some time to network and talk to each other. So with that, I want to welcome everybody and turn it over to Ana Ibarra.
Thank you, Neil. And thank you so much, everyone, for being with us here tonight. Just a quick note on interpretive services, if you need them. Si necesita intérprete y todavía no tiene el link, Evelyn les mandó un link a su correo electrónico, el que usaron para registrarse, y ahí pueden seguir la conversación en español. Gracias. So, welcome to tonight's CalMatters panel, Farmworker Health, How Can California Protect Its Essential Workers? So I'll start with some brief notes to set up context for our conversation, and then I'll introduce our panelists. California is home to more than 500,000 farm workers who play a key role in the state's $50 billion agricultural industry. In the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, the state defined farm workers as essential. But farm workers may not feel essential when some are subjected to poor working conditions, food insecurity, and lack of access to basic medical care. A study released last year by researchers at the UC Merced Community and Labor Center found that half of farm workers didn't have health insurance. About 2/3 expressed trouble paying for food or bills, and 15% reported not getting the minimum number of breaks as required by law. We also know that farm workers are exposed to several environmental and occupational hazards, such as high temperatures, wildfire smoke, and pesticides, which can pose immediate and long-term threats to their health. Almost 3/4 of the state's farm workers are undocumented immigrants, making them ineligible for many safety net benefits and vulnerable to threats of deportation. The UC Merced study was published around the same time that the state was paying close attention to farm workers' working and living conditions, following a mass shooting at 2 mushroom farms in Half Moon Bay. During a site visit following the incident, Governor Gavin Newsom was quoted in news reports saying, "Some of you should see where these folks are living, the conditions they are in. Living in shipping containers, folks getting $9 an hour, no health care, no support, no services." California has some of the most stringent workplace regulations. It has established overtime pay for ag workers, and most recently, it expanded Medi-Cal to undocumented people, likely to benefit many of these farm workers. But it will likely take a lot more to really make a dent in these inequities. In today's conversation, I hope we can discuss some of the current challenges and also look at what's in the work to address them. So we will have a conversation, a discussion with our panelists for roughly close to an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions from the public. So with that, let me introduce our panelists for tonight. First of all, thank you so much for being here. First, Edward Orozco Flores is a faculty director of the UC Merced Community and Labor Center, and he is a co-investigator on the Farmworker Health Study. Teresa Romero is president of the labor union United Farm Workers, and Sebastian Sanchez is deputy secretary for immigrant and agriculture workforce at the California Labor and Workforce Development Agency. I do want to say that we did invite organizations and agencies that represent and oversee growers and contractors. Unfortunately, we couldn't get anyone to join us here tonight, but we have 3 panelists with a wealth of knowledge, and I'm sure we'll have a great conversation. So let's get started with questions. Edward, I'm going to start with you. Your farm worker health study really touched on lots of issues from accessing medical care to food insecurity and workplace violations. You mentioned in your study that this is the first major statewide assessment of California's farm workers in more than 25 years. So my question for you is, compared to 25 years ago, how is California doing when it comes to farm worker issues? Where are we making the most progress? Where has it made the least?
Thank you, and thank you for the privilege of being on this panel. It's a good question. What progress has California made on farm worker standards in the past couple of decades? I think we want to be clear on where that starting point is. California has a greater concentration of large industrial farms than anywhere else in the country, and especially here in the Central Valley. And research has shown in those communities with the large industrial farms that wages are lower, that there's less money that circulates in the local economy, there's fewer small businesses, fewer community-based organizations, lower voting rates. And so in terms of the challenges that farm workers face, they've always been greater here. In the past couple of decades, there have been a number of policies that have passed, raising the labor standards for farm workers in California, thanks to the United Farm Workers and community-based organizations that serve farm workers, advocating on behalf of farm workers. There's the heat standard, the wildfire smoke standard. There's also wage and hour protections, overtime pay. And so all of these standards have now raised the standards for labor for farm work in California above the federal standards. I think where we see a need for improvement, where there's gaps, is in terms of enforcement, and as well in terms of there may be fewer heat-related deaths on the job where a worker collapses on the job and dies. There may be fewer of those, but the research still indicates that there are a number of people that are likely to be injured and to die within a day of high heat. And so being able to understand the consequences of heat on the job, kidney disease, renal failure in the long term, some of the more indirect consequences of the strenuous job. I think that's absolutely an area where policymaking should be focused on.
Thank you. Teresa, I want to ask you, what do you see as the most pressing issue from farm workers today? And what is your organization prioritizing now and this year?
Thank you. Before I answer, can I just recognize that Dolores Huerta is here with us, and she is the co-founder of the United Farm Workers, and she is somebody who I really respect and look up to because she has given her life to protect farm workers. Thank you, Dolores. Thank you. We have been, right now it is very good to hear that there is a report that now has statistics of what we know is happening. But in the farm worker movement, and farm workers say the laws in the books are not the laws in the fields. So the challenges that farm workers face right now are the challenges that have always faced. They are undocumented. They work seasonal work. They right now, when in 2022, we worked with Governor Newsom to get a bill that would make it safer for farm workers to organize, to unionize. And a lot of people said it's making it easier, but it wasn't. That's not the reality. It's safer. We have known of farm workers who have been fired because of the organizing, but not only that, they have been deported for organizing, or family members who work in the same farms where they work, the family members are fired. So the challenges that they face every day are great. Many of us like you just mentioned, farm workers were deemed essential workers. We always knew they were essential, but now the government says they're essential. And they were working every day. And for the most part, all the programs that existed at the state or federal level did not include farm workers because they were undocumented. So there is a lot of challenges they face every day. We talk about heat illness. It is here in the valley, we know that the temperatures can get 115, 120 degrees, and farm workers are working. And the law exists that they need to be protected. The law exists that they need to have rest periods, shade, and access to water, but it's not implemented. So that's the challenges that we have. The law says that they need to be informed by the employer of the symptoms and what they need to look for, but it doesn't happen. So in many cases, farm workers die because of the heat.
So heat and enforcement.
Absolutely, enforcement, and because it is difficult to enforce, union representation is key.
Sebastian, let me ask you, hearing Teresa's comments, I'll give you a moment to briefly tell us a little bit about what the state is working on to respond to some of those concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'll start with saying that Teresa and Ed are absolutely on point, and we really look to partners like them to provide us the information to help guide what policies we are going to take on. We agree that enforcement needs to improve. That is clear, and we are trying to address that by reducing the obstacles that farm workers have to engage our enforcement entities. We want to make sure that we are in communities. So we put in a budget change proposal in this year's budget, in the governor's budget. There's a proposal that would allow us to fund clinics in farm worker communities where we would have all our services. I think one of the things we hear from stakeholders is, from workers is they go to one agency and they're told, no, you need to go to another agency. We want to stop that and make sure that there's one location where farm workers can get all the information they need. We also want to really leverage all the resources we have across all our agencies. So we want to ensure that all our outreach and enforcement staff across the Agricultural Labor Relations Board, Cal-OSHA, the Labor Commissioner's Office, and EDD's Migrant Seasonal Farm Worker Outreach teams are trained at a minimum level to understand what rights and protections farm workers have, so that if they get any report, they can pass along a well-prepared report to their colleague in the entity that has jurisdiction over the matter. And finally, I think getting information on heat illness, absolutely agree that the data is showing that workers aren't reporting or may not even know what symptoms of heat illness are, and therefore are not reporting it. So we need to continue to invest in developing materials that effectively communicate to farm workers what their rights are, what their protections are, and being creative about who we work with. So we want to continue to work with trusted community partners. We've invested heavily in that over the past 3 years and want to continue doing that with a lot of the organizations present here today.
So I'm glad everyone's talking about heat illnesses and prevention. That's definitely a topic that I'm going to ask a little bit more about later. But I want to get to a question about healthcare and medical care, because we often need that to respond to other issues. One of the biggest gains in healthcare recently is this expansion of the Medi-Cal program to undocumented immigrants of all ages at the start of this year. This means that many more farm workers will become eligible for full medical benefits, not just emergency care. But the income limit to qualify for Medi-Cal is pretty low. For those of you who know, to qualify for Medi-Cal, a single person has to earn less than $20,000 a year, meaning there will be thousands of farm workers who are still left out. And by federal law, they're not allowed to buy health insurance or buy subsidized health insurance on Covered California. So, Edward, for you, what are the options for people who don't get health insurance through their job, who don't qualify for Medi-Cal, and what do we know about how they're seeking care?
For those persons that don't qualify for various forms of health coverage and cannot access it through family members, there are clinics that are often used, federally qualified health centers or lookalikes, and but the issue is the type of care that those clinics provide is just general care. It's not specialty care. So for any conditions that require specialized treatment, farm workers who cannot access health coverage are unable to have those issues treated.
And we're talking things like kidney failure, cancer, diabetes, all many things or some of the things that you mentioned in your study too. I do want to comment on one thing that I learned recently. Colorado has a program called Omni Salud, where they are creating sort of a health insurance marketplace specifically for undocumented immigrants. And I was speaking to Assemblymember Joaquin Arambula earlier this month, and he's carrying a bill that would do something similar. So a health insurance marketplace with reduced coverage plans for undocumented immigrants. So that's something I'll be watching for this year. Sebastian, speaking of the safety net, for the past 2 years, legislators have introduced bills to expand unemployment insurance to undocumented workers who, as we know, are currently excluded. Those bills have either died in the legislature or have been vetoed by the governor. But similar to Medi-Cal and driver's licenses, we know that benefits for undocumented immigrants are often a work of many, many years. Sebastian, can you talk about where the state is in those conversations? And other than, I guess, a healthier state budget, what will the state need to make unemployment insurance a reality for this population?
As you know, and I can't speak on any pending legislation at the moment, but the Employment Development Department last year did produce a report to the legislature on what it would take and to create a similar unemployment insurance system. It would take around $300 million, maybe more, and it would take some time, at least 6 years, to develop the system that would be able to administer that. So it would require substantive investment from the state to move something like that forward.
I want to move the conversation a bit into workplace regulations and safety standards. UC Merced's Farmworker research showed that 27% of farm workers were unaware of their right to file a workplace health and safety complaint. That's things like dealing with sanitation, heat protections, like we were talking about. And 36% say they would not be willing to file a report with Cal OSHA. Teresa, I wanted to ask you, does that surprise you at all? Can you talk about the obstacles and fears, perhaps, that farm workers face when filing these reports? And what do you think can make this easier?
It doesn't surprise me. We talk to farm workers. We communicate with farm workers on a daily basis, even those who are not under union contract, because when we try to pass a law, legislation is for every farm worker, not just for our members. But it doesn't surprise me. They're afraid. If we think about it, just during the pandemic, farm workers continued to work. Their kids were not going to school. They made the decision, okay, do we need to bring him? Do we leave him in the car? Do I leave him alone? And when there is a problem, they just take it. They don't want to report it because they don't want to lose the job that is supporting their families. And I think if we try to put ourselves on their shoes, we could understand why they make the decision, but that it is wrong. And the fact that now in California, a farm worker can organize and can vote for union representation in a way that is safe, that is confidential, that is a secret ballot, gives them another opportunity. All these things are not going to change unless there's somebody there that is speaking for them. Like he just says, some things might take 6 years to implement. Farm workers should not wait 6 years. They're the people who are putting food on our tables.
On that note, Sebastian, I'll go back to you. Can you briefly walk us through what reporting and investigating violations should look like, and where people can get information, or where should they start when filing a complaint?
With CalOSHA or?
With CalOSHA.
Okay. CalOSHA does both proactive investigations and also receives complaints. And it also receives referrals from people that are not workers, people that have seen violations. Once those complaints come in, it should be there's a regulatory requirement that within 6 months of having received the complaint, CalOSHA needs to have completed their investigation. After that, employers have a right to appeal, and it's become a very common strategy for employers is to appeal to further delay the process. So then that goes to our CalOSHA's legal team to appear before the CalOSHA board to defend that citation that CalOSHA has sent. But in practice, a farm worker can call our hotline. Our farm worker can go directly to one of our district offices to file their complaint. But we know that that's not enough. We certainly know that that's not enough, and we are working, for example, with the UC Merced Community and Labor Center on a regional relationship building initiative where we're bringing together local community-based organizations with CalOSHA's district office managers and regional managers to build that connection so that there can be a better way to refer cases directly from those organizations to workers. Workers feel more comfortable talking to those organizations, and that can really help expedite how we do our investigations.
When we were talking earlier this week, you mentioned something about creating this no wrong door policy. Is that for CalOSHA complaints, or is that different?
Absolutely. The no wrong door policies for whether it's a wage and hour complaint, a complaint about not being able to unionize, a complaint about not having a safe or healthy workplace. So that is really our goal, is to make sure that all of our offices, all of our staff have that basic capacity to at least identify and be able to refer adequately those types of cases. And I just want to take a step back really quickly on the concerns that farm workers have with actually filing. I believe, Ed, and you can correct me on the data point, in the UC Merced report, about over 3/4 of the workers that said they wouldn't file a complaint said that they wouldn't do it because of their immigration status. California had the first the request for deferred action for labor enforcement filed in the country through the Labor Commissioner's Office. CalOSHA has designated 3 attorneys to specifically work on those deferred action requests, the certifying statements for deferred action. And the governor had the Department of Social Services and Labor Agency work on a program to provide immigration services for farm workers that are concerned about their immigration status and filing. So we're trying to figure out different ways to address some of these obstacles.
Going back to heat. Here are my questions about heat, because I know it's an important topic, especially here in the Central Valley and in Bakersfield, where it can get, easily triple digits, July, August, September, really hot. California is one of the few states that has heat standards for outdoor workers. Edward, but your study showed that 43% of farm workers said their employers never provided a heat illness prevention plan as mandated by CalOSHA. Can you talk a bit about what a heat illness prevention plan includes, and what do we know about why farm workers aren't receiving this?
A heat illness prevention plan that's mandated under the state of California requires an employer in agriculture, construction, landscaping, or the oil and gas industry to have a posted plan that explains, the provisions of the heat rule. And so this includes over 80, when the temperature exceeds 80 degrees, having shade that's accessible to those working, water as well, drinkable water. When the temperature exceeds 95 degrees, having the implementation of some a system to supervise workers for symptoms of heat illness, as well as rest breaks every 2 hours. And so the statistic in our study that 43% of farm workers said that there was never a posted heat plan at their work site indicates that there's a high level of non-compliance. In our survey, we interviewed over 1,200 farm workers, so that's already several hundred cases of farm workers saying that they don't have this plan posted at their workplace. And so although we have seen the more egregious forms of heat-related deaths decline in recent years, the research also does indicate that there are still many people that are becoming injured and dying within a day of high heat. And this is significant because it takes hours, several hours for heat illness to turn into heat stroke and for someone to die. So it's indicating that there's still further reform that's necessary.
And it's very common in Kern, in the Central Valley, really to start seeing headlines, starting summer about heat-related deaths. Teresa, last summer you joined U.S. Senator Alex Padilla and Delano in support of the Asunción Valdivia Heat Illness Injury and Fatality Prevention Act, which would essentially establish federal heat protections for workers. For those not familiar with the backstory, Valdivia was a farm worker who died in 2004 from heat stroke picking grapes in Kern County. So this conversation, more than 20 years. What would federal protections add to what's already mandated by the state? Can you tell us more about this?
It would just make it to where these protections are at the federal level, not just, right now, farm workers, as we all know, don't have labor rights. They were excluded from all labor rights in the 1930s. So what it would do is protect not only farm workers, like it just said, but all outside workers. In some of those workers that work in, driving vehicles that don't have air conditioning, things like that, they would have protections. I go back to the same thing. We have the law here in California, but unless the employers are willing to implement it, we're going to continue to have the same problems. As important as it is to have shade and rest and water, it is information. Workers need to be informed. Most of us here would not recognize the symptoms of heat illness. And by the time a farm worker realizes that he is or she is in big trouble, it is too late. So the federal law would help at the federal level, so we don't have to do this type of legislation state by state.
I'm curious, what do you usually hear from employers when you ask about why they're not having these or distributing these heat-related plans or heat illness plans, excuse me?
For the most part, they won't talk to me. They won't talk to the UFW, but the excuses that we have heard is that they do have them, but that the workers are not reading them, or the workers are not interested, or the workers are not learning. In many cases, we talk to workers and they have no idea what their rights are. And we go back to the laws in the books are not the laws in the fields.
I have another question about environmental concerns, and Edward or Teresa, please feel free. This is about wildfire smoke, also an issue of concern here in the Valley. When I first moved to the Central Valley, it's actually 10 years ago, I moved from LA to Merced, and the first thing I learned was that the Central Valley is shaped like a bowl, right? So when we're surrounded by mountains, and even when wildfires are far away from us, the pollutants drift in and get stuck here. That's on top of the pollution we already have. What do we know about how this new normal is having on the health of workers, and how can employers and the state better protect them from wildfire smoke? Any thoughts?
For me?
From anyway.
Farm workers unfortunately had learned to adapt and adjust to horrible working conditions. When there's a fire, we try to reach out to farm workers that are in the middle of the fire, and they're working. The owners are not in the fields, they're in their homes being protected. They're not even providing masks to farm workers. And they have, once again, the tendency to accept that because of many conditions that I mentioned earlier. But I think this is something that, again, we create legislation that would protect these workers. And at the same time, make sure that when there is a program that would give financial help to the employers who lost their crops, that some of it goes to the workers. The programs, nothing goes to the workers. And they're the ones that really lose, and they're the ones that, can't work because there is no money there for them.
Sebastian, I think you want to add
Yeah,
something.
I mean, I think we keep touching on the lack of awareness, lack of understanding, or employers not moving forward. And I think that's a critical point. The state has made significant investments in trying to spread information about high heat. We had a high heat campaign that put out hundreds of billboards, thousands of ads on radio. But we learned that that was not enough. We need to continue doing. Over the past 3 years, we've invested over $100 million in funding over 60 organizations throughout the state to do outreach to workers directly where they live and they congregate. We've also funded a program called the Statewide Agriculture and Farm Worker Education Program that has been working with employers to train workers directly in the fields. I think that's a critical part of our outreach, is to engage employers and try to figure out how we can get training directly where workers are working so that they know their rights while they are actually working. That's a program where we've worked with organizations like the Grower Shipper Association. We've worked with the California Farmworker Foundation. These are all entities that have access to workers in the fields, and we think it's critical to reach them, as well as continuing to fund the many organizations that are doing daily outreach to workers on a day-to-day basis.
Going back, tying this back to an earlier question about, what is the progress that is being made and where are there remaining gaps? So in discussing engagement with agricultural employers around improved labor standards, such as the wildfire smoke standard, making sure that it's being complied with and that, that there's proper oversight and enforcement. One of the most important tools that has been developed in recent years for engaging employers has been the concept of the High Road Framework. This was the state's Workforce Development Board published a big 600-page report in 2019, introducing the concept and really making it a blueprint for advancing on the state's ambitious climate goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and become carbon neutral. And recently, the federal government launched through the USDA a $65 million program, the Farm Labor Stabilization and Protection Pilot Program, that provides subsidies to agricultural employers who employ guest workers who show that they're raising their labor standards. And so I think from the perspective of a labor standard, we would say that that High Road Framework that engages employers that are in support of raising standards through public subsidies is a strategic use of public resources, of tying labor standards to public resources to ensure that we're engaging with employers and raising those standards. And the challenge that remains is that there are growers, there are associations that are organized that have not yet supported this High Road Framework, and that's the work that's left to be done.
I'll just note, I think Ed makes a great point about how we can use our workforce development system to continue to promote high road training principles and to make sure that there are good jobs in California. We have funded multiple high road training partnerships in agriculture. We also recently announced just under $10 million in funding for the Farmworker Advancement Program, where we're asking groups to work with employers, local workforce boards, and creating training for farm workers that not only upskills those workers or provides them with basic skills to find better jobs, but also to create better working conditions for workers. So totally agree that we should continue to use our workforce development system as another way to improve the living and working conditions of farm workers.
On the impacts of climate change, and maybe that gets a little bit to it, I'm wondering if, an open question for whoever wants to weigh in, what will these jobs look like in the future, and how should we, California, the state, employers, employees, be preparing to adjust to the new reality brought on by climate change? Everybody wants to start.
With the heat illness, One of the things that employers are doing is changing the times where the workers work. And instead of working during the day, they have them working at night. And they do it based on the date that it happens, based on the week that the temperatures are going to be very high. But just imagine what chaos that creates in a farm worker family. A farm worker today is supposed to work during the day. They have arranged for the kids to go to school, to come home, and all of a sudden they say for the next 3 days you're going to be working at night. It is just not, it is cruel, because on top of working when it is dark, when it is even more dangerous, they have to face these challenges of changing their schedules in short notice, and they don't know what to do with their families, with their kids. We would all, I think anybody who has young kids and has to work, if they have to change their schedule every day or every week, it would be, it's very challenging. It's very challenging.
One of the tools that agricultural employers and the associations that they work with have been trying to use in order to improve climate resiliency with the increasing heat and climate change has been automation, investment in advancing technological development and the use of agricultural production, right, ag tech. But the history of industrialization has shown us that when workers do not have input in the design phase, in the use of technology and its implementation in the workplace, that oftentimes the work can simply be made to be rote, repetitive, and to justify paying lower wages to workers. It doesn't necessarily work to the benefit of workers. It's different if workers are at the table, if they have input into the design phase, because they are the experts. They understand how the job best gets done. And a risk of investing so much in automation with rising heat and not having worker input is that we could be creating tasks, repetitive motions that make people more vulnerable, to heat illness. The questions we should be asking is how can we better engage the organizations that represent the interests of farm workers in these massive, massive federal and state investments. I think it's close to about 100 million here in the Central Valley that are focused on advancing technological development in agriculture.
And if you don't mind, climate change is clearly a key thing that we need to confront as we move towards the future with farm work. At the direction of the Secretary of Labor, Stuart Knox, I spent the past year and a half meeting with stakeholders, meeting with growers, meeting with workers, meeting with organizations, as Ed mentioned, that work daily with workers, to think through what are the things that we can do to prepare farm workers. Absolutely need to give them basic skills so that they can be the people that use that automated technology, so that they are the people that are doing the precision agriculture. We need to make sure that farm workers who may not have English literacy have that English literacy, that don't have digital literacy are provided that digital literacy. We want to see farm workers become the people that handle that technology if it's going to happen. And we also need to prepare them if, because of drought, because of wildfire, because of storms, there is no work. We need to prepare them to be able to be competitive in the job market field. As well, I mentioned the Farm Worker Advancement Program, where we invested $10 million in this type of training. We also had the Employment Training Panel put out $10 million to ask employers to train workers in these skills, because we want to address the impact of climate change on farm workers.
Another thing looking into the future, right? I think any industry that we talk to, one of the main concerns is this aging population. We're aging everywhere, right? And especially in an aging workforce is a concern, I'm guessing, in labor-intensive industries, right? How should California, both the state and employers, be working to prepare to accommodate for an aging workforce. And I'm not talking about just us getting older. California's population in general is skewing older, right? So we're losing younger workers. Any thoughts from anyone? Open question for anyone who wants to jump in.
I think we need to ask why people need to work that long in something that is very physically demanding. We know that our citizens of this country don't want to work in the fields, and we continue to bring immigrant workers. And we continue to have them work and have no representation, no rights to unionize, no voice that would speak with them. Let me share with you something that happened. We, a couple of years ago, we invited all 100 US senators to work in the fields one day. And one of the senators who accepted was Senator Alex Padilla. And as he's working there, he's a very tall man and he's on his knees and he is harvesting radishes with a worker next to him who's training him. And the worker is so fast, so efficient, that the senator was very surprised and said, "My God, you're so good. How long have you been doing this?" And his answer was 50 years. And he was shocked because he didn't look, he looked much younger. And he says, why don't you, how old are you? And he says, 70 years old. And he says, why don't you retire? He says, because I am undocumented. I pay taxes, they deduct taxes from my paycheck, but I could never be able to collect Social Security. So as long as we continue to do that and to treat him like that and not to give him the benefits of the Social Security, a pension, a fair pay, union representation, we're always going to have these aging force that have to work to survive. He clearly said to him, if I don't work, I don't eat.
One thing that was mentioned earlier was that agricultural workers were excluded from modern day worker standards. The history of that is one of racism in America. In the 1930s, when modern day worker standards were introduced through the National Labor Relations Act, through the Fair Labor Standards Act, it was legislators from the South who did not want black workers having the same rights as white workers, that excluded domestic workers and agricultural workers from modern day worker standards because those were the occupations that black workers concentrated in. The intent was to preserve a caste system, and that still persists today. The only difference is instead of it being largely African-American workers in those industries, in many parts of the country, it is now immigrant, and especially non-citizens, undocumented persons who are now in these occupations. So to the extent to which there's a need for people to be doing this work, and the industry recognizes a growing crisis and a labor shortage, the simple answer is to raise the standards in those occupations federally, to for those workers to have the same rights as all other workers, because this would increase the size of the labor pool. If people saw that these were good jobs, that they were better jobs, you would lose fewer workers. Right now, unfortunately, there are people that think of these jobs as something to leave behind for something better. There is no shortage of people in the state of California. And so we can go a long way in improving standards. Even in the absence of improved federal standards, we can still improve standards in the state.
I think I'm going to close my questions with that. We have plenty of questions that were submitted from people watching or who are watching online. I can move on to those, but if anybody here has questions and you want to start moving to the microphone up there, that would be great. I'll start with one of these, and then you can go to the microphone. Yeah. One thing we didn't talk about much, but I think it's also important to bring up. Someone, Diana online asks, what are the prevalent mental health challenges among farm workers and how can these be addressed? Mental health among farm workers, challenges and what can we do to help them? Any thoughts from anyone?
And I know your report touched on mental health issues.
I'd have to go look at the report.
You know, I think the farm workers do have many challenges and it affects their mental health. I don't believe that they have even the time and the ability to give the time to look at those issues, you know, because they have so many challenges in life. I think if we had the ability to evaluate farm workers, we would find a very, and I don't know, Ed, maybe you did part of it in your report, but we would find a lot of challenges that they have. What they do is they ignore them, they put them behind them because their priorities are to work and to support their family.
The majority of farm workers in our study reported the highest level of fear of their family being separated. So for any person to encounter, to have that level of fear for something that matters so much to them, is going to take a toll on their mental health.
And they live with that day in and day out.
Well, we have a line now with questions from the public. So let's start. First question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Fausto Sanchez, and I'm representing the indigenous community. I come with my group, Unidad Popular Benito Juárez. And my question is that we know that about regards to the 2010 census, 35% of the farm workers who works in the field, they are indigenous people who doesn't speak too much Spanish. But we are talking here that they are receiving training. The farm workers are receiving trainings how to take care of them, and the employers are providing the training. But the problem is that the trainings are only in Spanish, and the information to those who speaks Mixteco, Zapoteco, or Triqui, they do not get that information. As you know that 6 or 7 years ago, one of our the people from Oaxaca, Isabel, dies because she did not receive the training about the heat. So my question is the state or the federal government are doing something to that this information that is providing to everybody who works in the field about health and safety, if they are going to receive that training in their language, or how the employers are going to do so their workers who doesn't speak Spanish receive that information as well. That is my question. Thank you.
No, Mariana? Absolutely, Fausto. Agree with you. There's a substantial population of our agricultural workforce that only speaks indigenous languages. Part of the statewide agriculture and farm worker education program, we've been working with both the Mixteco Indígena Community Organizing Project, MICOP, and the Centro Nacional para el Desarrollo Indígena Oaxaqueño, CBDIO, to develop content in indigenous languages. And I'll note that through that program, we've put out over 100 videos and audio recordings in 19 different languages, including many of the indigenous languages that you mentioned. Part of the budget change proposal that we've put in for this year's budget calls specifically for funding so that we can continue to develop that audio and visual outreach material that can reach indigenous language speaking farm workers.
Am I next? Hi, my name is Tanya Salinas. I am the president of the Central Labor Council here in Kern County. So I think that the discussion is more in terms of the laws are out there, right? In regards to OSHA, and OSHA protects you regardless of your documentation status, right? And one of the things that we have found is that even with the laws in place, even those that are not necessarily farm workers, your industry workers, your telecommunication people, right? The warehouse employees, they're all having the same grievances as well when it comes to the heat illness. So I think that we need to go back to the table. Do we need a bill? Well, we already have bills, right? We need further bills, obviously, to be able to make sure that our undocumented farm workers are included. But I think that it needs to go back to what Professor Flores mentioned earlier, that there needs to be where if the industry is getting the tax breaks, right? That they need, that we need to ensure that the labor standards are included with those tax breaks, and making sure that if the employer does not follow the mandated law or the mandated rules, that they get reprimanded. And I think that's the problem here, that we're not at the table. The farm workers are not at the table, and those regulations are not included in those subsidies. So we need to stop giving breaks when they themselves are not giving breaks to the farm workers. And that's the bottom line. So that's more of a comment than a
So it's a
question.
comment, not a question.
So how do we ensure that that happens?
How do we ensure that that happens? I think you're absolutely right. Enforcement needs to improve. We know that we need to improve it from things like staffing, and we are in a dedicated campaign to improve our hiring capacity, as well as do an outreach to folks throughout the state to encourage them to apply to CalOSHA jobs. We're looking at whether or not there are jobs that we can change the qualifications so that we can attract a wider pool of applicants. And on top of that, we need to remove the obstacles to engaging the enforcement. And I've talked a bit about how we are trying to do that to make sure that we're reaching directly to workers, that we're working with central labor councils like yours, and we're working with community-based organizations to remove those obstacles. On the workforce front, I think California jobs, the state knows that they need to be good jobs, and we want them to be good jobs. And we're working to encourage that. Like I said, in the Farmworker Advancement Program and the employment training panels ag initiative, both of those programs explicitly call for improving working conditions through the training programs that are created. So we are incorporating that kind of standard into some of our funding programs. And I agree with you that it's something that we need to continue to explore.
Thank you.
And let me tell you, for farm workers, probably the only way that to be able to make sure that the laws are enforced are through a contract. Because that way they are informed of what their rights are, and we're there to make sure that those rights are protected. So that is key, because farm workers are not going to, in many cases, even make a call. So that would make a huge difference for them.
Right, because it is a catch-22. You got farm workers that, they got to put food on the table.
Mhm.
So the question is, do I go ahead and lose my hours?
Mhm.
They don't get paid by the hour. A lot of times they get paid by the bucket.
Mhm.
So you got to make sacrifices to be able to feed your family. So absolutely right. And the bills are already there. But the problem is that the industry is not following the mandated law. So that's why we go back to those contracts to make sure that if they're going to go ahead and get subsidies, that they make it into the contract that they have to make sure that they're following the mandated law. And then OSHA needs to make sure they follow up on that to make sure that that is being enforced. And if it's not being enforced, then they need to be reprimanded. As simple as that.
What I hear is that there's a need to have, standards attached with public subsidies in ways that, for example, the USDA's FLSP program is doing. And the question is how to actually write language that ensures that subsidies are going to those that are raising their standards. To respond to the point about efforts to improve enforcement in CalOSHA, there was an article, a newspaper article that just came out today that did an analysis of data from CalOSHA and found that in the past 3 years there was less than one applicant for each open position in that agency. I guess what I'm hearing is that there are several areas where we haven't even begun to do the work that experts in the field of labor are identifying are really critical and urgent.
Well, I won't take more of your time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm going to start off in Spanish because I see that we do have a lot of Spanish-speaking folks. Yo soy la nieta de braceros. Mis padres, mi mamá que está aquí, mi papá trabajaron en FIL más de 20 años. Entonces, para mí el tema de los trabajadores agrícolas es súper importante y es algo que siempre cargo en cada capacidad que estoy. Saying that, One of the, thank you. One of the many hats that I wear is I am the regional program manager for Northern California and the Sierras. It's actually one of the biggest regions in the state of California. I've had the opportunity to work with some of you all in some capacity. My question is in regard to healthcare equity within regards to the H2A population. I had the opportunity to work with Siskiyou County, one of the North State counties in the state of California, where we sat and coordinated the first health fair for the region. One of the things that they identified was there was a huge H2A population that comes from the border throughout California. And they did not have medical continuation of care as they were coming throughout the state. And they saw this as a barrier because while we were having this event on a Sunday, it was the only day off that they had. So if they wanted to get medical eligibility, they wouldn't be able to because, of course, county offices open only Monday through Friday. So my question to you is, how can we make healthcare more equitable and accessible, specifically for the H2A population that is a population that we see and there are neighbors, but they're often forgotten. Would it fall into legislation? Would it fall more into like local county jurisdiction, or what is your recommendation? Because I think at this time, the public health director that I was working with in Siskiyou County saw that there was a lot of barriers and parameters around who can be eligible for Medi-Cal. And as you know, every jurisdiction has a different regional Medi-Cal system. So even if they were to come through the border and come up to the state, they would have to change Medi-Cal every single time they switch to the regional county Medi-Cal system. So what would you propose, and what are some next steps forward that we can take as a community to create more equitable populations for our state?
I'll just mention very briefly that one point that you touched on, that it may be challenging for farm workers to be able to access healthcare because of the fact that they work 6 days a week and certain offices are only open, certain days, certain times. This is part of the importance of the safety net for all initiative that Sebastian referred to earlier, that unless workers have an economic security, like an economic safety net, that they will feel vulnerable to the threat of retaliation from their employer. In our survey that Sebastian referenced, 64% of those who said that they would not file a complaint against their employer said that they feared retaliation through job loss, hours reduction, deportation. So removing that fear of losing your job because you didn't show up for one day, you called in sick one day to go take care of this important thing. There are people that would say that, that's the most important thing, yeah.
No, and I agree with them. And unfortunately, if you think about it, fear is one of the most difficult emotions to surpass. It's you can rationalize with somebody, but fear is going to take over. I think, and I am looking at from my perspective, the time that the organization that can help farm workers is the United Farm Workers. Organizing, having a union contract, take advantage of the new law is what is going to help farm workers, because then they would have rights, they would have protections, they would have a voice, which is what they don't have right now. They don't have a voice.
I don't have an answer for that question, but that sounds like a good story idea. So you and I should talk later.
Thank you so
Teresa,
much.
I do want to, I hope we have one more question, but I wanted to ask on the point you made about, bringing the farm workers to the table through organizing. I know that your union represents about 7,000 workers statewide, and that's really a fraction of the entire, farm worker population in the state. Can you talk about, why aren't more farm workers unionizing? What are some of the challenges you see when, you go out and try to organize?
And it is the F word that we've been using a lot, fear. In the past, like I said earlier, farm workers have been fired. Farm workers for organizing, for supporting a union, have been deported. As Ed said just a minute ago, that's one of the biggest fear, being separated from the children, their family. The law that we have right now as of October of 2022, it is making it safer for farm workers to join a union. In the past, they would not even want to talk about it because they were terrified. But now they can do it. They can talk to the union. They can sign a card. That is their vote. That is confidential. That is secret. That gives them the protection that they didn't have before this law. And we're seeing that is making a difference with farm workers. They are more engaged. They're taking leadership, and they are coming to us once they understand the law. And that is going to make a difference. That is really going to make a difference.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, so we'll take those last 2. Su pregunta.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Araceli Barrios y yo trabajé por 28 años o un poco más en el campo. Tengo la experiencia y todo lo que he estado oyendo de todo lo que pasa en el campo y cómo poder ayudar a las personas que están en el campo. A mí me tocó trabajar de noche y ahorita que estaban diciendo sobre lo del golpe de calor y eso, a nosotros nunca nos dieron información sobre eso. Una vez estaba trabajando yo en Huron y llevaba a mi hijo como de 17 años y no había agua, se terminó toda el agua y yo lo que hice, que traía mi hielera y ya se había descongelado el hielo, entonces yo lo que hice es guardar esa agua para dársela a mi hijo y la gente, me tocó ver gente que se desmayó a un lado de mí, pero yo prefería darle esa agua a mi hijo. Entonces, todo lo que estoy oyendo, cómo ayudar a las personas del campo, cómo yo pienso que ir ahí, irlos a buscar, entregarles folletos sobre lo del calor, los golpes de calor que mucha gente no sabe y sobre los derechos de los trabajadores. Ir a entregar, yo estaría dispuesta, le estaba diciendo, ella es mi jefa, Ruth López, estoy tan agradecida con ella por haberme dado la oportunidad, a pesar de que yo no hablo inglés, ella me dio la confianza de estar con ella y me aceptó porque si usted tiene la experiencia, o sea, todo lo que he vivido, o sea, yo no necesito escribir nada porque yo lo viví. ¿Me entienden? Y sí es cierto que uno va a trabajar muchas horas. Me hicieron a veces firmar 2 tarjetas, una para pagarme horas regulares y otra para no pagarme el overtime. Y muchas injusticias, pero a veces uno lo aguanta. ¿Por qué? Porque no tienes papeles, porque nadie te orienta, nadie te ayuda. Entonces ahora yo todo lo que he aprendido y me encanta todo esto y las veces que ella me ha mandado a capacitarme, se lo agradezco mucho porque ahora yo siento que yo soy la voz de otras personas para ayudarlos y nos tenemos que fijar en eso porque todos los alimentos, todo lo que se va, todo lo que sufre uno y acoso sexual también hubo muchas cosas de que fuimos abusados y por eso me encanta ahorita todo lo que están diciendo y podemos ir a los campos nosotros a entregar folletos, a orientar a las personas para que no tengan miedo de hablar y que se les puede ayudar y que podemos mejorar porque son los menos pagados también y los que más trabajan.
Gracias, Araceli. Araceli is really making the point of using farm workers to advocate for other farm workers and actually educate, going to the fields, going to where they're at working, and for people to be able to share their story. Thank you, gracias, Araceli, por compartir.
Y gracias por haber trabajado tantos años en el campo. Muchas gracias.
Okay, 2 more. Okay, last 2 questions, and then Neil is going to kick us out.
Hi, I'm April Reed. I'm a staff writer with Converge Magazine at CSUB. And so I guess my question is, because I know it seems like a lot of people here have close ties with farm workers. I personally don't. So I'm wondering how somebody that feels more like the outsider can help assist, those that are having troubles like you guys have explained.
Do you live in the area?
Yes.
There's a lot of farm workers in this county. There's a lot of people that you can reach out to and listen to them and guide them who they can talk to. There's a lot of places who want volunteers that want to do that kind of work. You're young, you're the future leader of this area, this country. Get engaged, get involved. Talk to right now, the population that we're talking about here is farm workers. And they're the ones that put food on your table and my table every day. And the fact that you are here is because you have some interest. Talk to them, listen to them, guide them, have them call our offices, talk to somebody who can help them, call CalOSHA, call places where they can get help. And the more you get involved, the more you're going to learn how you can impact their lives. And that's great that you're wanting to do that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I will speak in Spanish because my English is no well. Yo soy Yuridia López de Líderes Campesinas. Nosotros trabajamos directamente en los campos y apoyamos y llevamos recursos a las comunidades. Mi pregunta es referente a la salud mental. Ustedes comentaron que existe el problema, sabemos que existe. Hemos hablado mucho de la palabra equidad, que queremos que toda la gente tenga lo que se merece y lo que necesita para vivir. Pero hemos visto una desigualdad enorme, abismal entre nuestros trabajadores campesinos. Nosotros trabajamos con un proyecto que se llama NACES, que es un proyecto en el que nosotros sondeamos a 50 personas de Bakersfield referente a los problemas o los traumas infantiles. Muchas de nuestras comunidades tienen problemas de violencia doméstica o problemas que nos han traído inseguridades a nuestra edad adulta y problemas de salud, ¿verdad? Entonces, mi pregunta es, ¿qué estamos haciendo para favorecer la salud mental sabiendo que existen traumas infantiles en nuestra comunidad campesina y en nuestra comunidad latina en general?
I can't talk specifically to proposals on how to improve the mental health, but I think one of the key things that both Araceli and Suget are mentioning is who are the people that are doing the outreach to workers, who are talking to them. The state has made a substantial investment in developing promotoras and really investing in people like Araceli to become the people that do outreach to workers, that have that direct knowledge of what a farm worker is going through. So I think that's a small step that we can take to make access to mental health care, to other types of services easier, is to really invest in training for farm workers to be able to do this type of work.
And in many cases, farm workers don't even, and many of us, not only farm workers, recognize that we are having those issues. And even when we recognize them, it's very difficult to really act on it. So I think you have the perfect audience, talking to them, making them feel comfortable that there is nothing wrong with that, and figure out how to help them. I think what you guys are doing is great.
We'll stop there. Neil's going to take the mic back. Thank you again, everyone, for giving us the time.
Thank you all. Wonderful conversation. I do want to thank everybody for coming out, and don't take off quite yet. I want to thank the crew working here, especially our event producer, Evelyn Chavez. Evelyn is from here. Her family's here. Her parents are here tonight too. Thank you for coming. I want to ask our dear friend Dolores Huerta to join us if you would. Got it. What you said at the end there, I'm somebody who lives in California, and every day I have this wonderful food on my table, right? And it's important to know why. What can the people who are here, and we have an audience watching around the state, when we hear about the challenges for farm workers, what, aside from feeling and understanding and feeling sympathy and empathy, what should people be doing about these issues, whether they live here or anywhere in California?
Well, these conversations have been going on for the last 60 years.
Just step closer to the camera here, I think, right?
Okay. Yeah, and what people are saying have been going on for the last 60 years, okay? I started organizing farm workers when I was 25. I am now going to be 94. So we can say 70 years, And the fact that we are still having these conversations means that we have failed. We have failed. And we have to remember that when we talk about essential workers, and they talk about the firemen, and they talk about the policemen, and they talk about the healthcare workers, Farm workers are the ones that feed all of the other essential workers and everybody that's sitting here and everybody here in our country. And so when we continue to hear about the abuses against farm workers, that means that all of us have to step up and do more. Number one, I think the state has to do more. There's no reason why farm workers have to go through labor contractors to get a job. When Governor Jerry Brown was governor, they had the unemployment agencies. They had trailers out there where farmers could go to find a job without going through a labor contractor. You know, we had five farm workers that were killed just so farm workers could get water and bathrooms, respirators, and the right to organize. And when we think of all of the sacrifices that farm workers have made, there's no reason why we should be in the same place that we were, 70 years ago or 100 years ago. So that means we all have to step up. And we know, as I've said, the president of the United Farm Workers, that the only way that we're going to be able to get farm workers the type of security and power that they need is when they have the union, okay? Now we know that the agricultural industry, in spite of the jillions of dollars that they have made, they still do not want to recognize the fact that their workers have the right to have a union. They have a right to have their organization, just like the growers have their organizations. They have the Western Growers, the Farm Bureau Federation, the Grape and Tree Fruit League, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they will not let the workers have an organization to represent them. And so I think that's what we have to do. You want to know what to do? Help the union, support the union, okay? So that workers can have their own voice and their own power. Sí se puede.
Sí se puede.
Thank you so much for being here. I remember being at your 89th birthday party in Sacramento, and you haven't changed a bit. Thank you so much for being here. I want to thank everybody for joining us, especially our panelists for taking the time out this evening. Stick around, there's some food. We'll have a chance to talk a little bit afterwards. Thank you all very much for coming.